He put out the ad because the silence in his house was a scream. She answered it because the world behind her was on fire. He was a rancher with a buried past. She was a widow with a stolen future. And when Samuel Vance opened his door to Cora Hale and her 2 young sons, neither of them knew they were standing on a fault line. The ground beneath them was about to break. The knock came hard and fast, cutting through the quiet like a gunshot. Samuel Vance didn't get many visitors, and that's the way he liked it. For 5 years, the only sounds on this ridge were the wind, the cattle, and the ghosts he refused to speak to. But this knock was different. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a lost traveler. This was the sound of trouble arriving on schedule. He moved slow, his hand brushing the worn stock of the rifle leaning against the wall. A man doesn't live this far from the law without learning to greet the world with suspicion. He pulled the heavy oak door open just a crack. The woman on his porch didn't flinch. The wind whipped her hair across a face that was worn, but not weak. Dust coated her dress, the kind that settles after days on the road. 2 boys clung to her skirts, shadows with wide, serious eyes. The older one, maybe 10, stood with his chin up, a tiny soldier ready for a war he didn't understand. The younger one was barely tall enough to see over the porch rail, his thumb jammed in his mouth. "I'm Cora Hale," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in it, the kind that comes from holding yourself together for too long. "You posted an ad for a housekeeper." Samuel's eyes scanned the empty yard behind her. He'd expected a wagon, a husband, something, but there was just her, the boys, and a single exhausted-looking mule tied to the fence. The silence stretched. "I did," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. "We came from Bridgewater," she added, as if that explained the hollows under her eyes. 4 days. The older boy stepped forward slightly. "I'm Eli," he announced, his gaze flicking from Samuel to the rifle and back again. "This is Jonah." Jonah just stared, his eyes impossibly big. Samuel gave a single, sharp nod. "Come in." He swung the door open, stepping aside without a welcome. It wasn't a greeting. It was a surrender. The house smelled of cold coffee and solitude. It was a man's space, clean, but empty of comfort. A single plate sat on the table, a testament to 1,000 lonely meals. Cora's gaze swept the room, taking inventory of everything that was missing. It was a skill women like her learned fast. "You got space for us?" she asked, her bag hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Samuel grunted, pointing with his chin toward a dark hallway. 2 rooms back there. Wasn't expecting children." "Weren't expecting much of anything, I gather," she replied, no heat in her words, just a flat statement of fact. She looked around again, her jaw tight. "We can make it work. We'll earn our keep, Mr. Vance. We don't take charity." "I wasn't offering any," he said. "Good." A muscle in her jaw twitched. "Then we understand each other." And just like that, it began. Not with a handshake, but with a silent truce. A woman and 2 boys, standing in the middle of a stranger's life, because they had nowhere else on earth to go. He didn't ask about her husband. She didn't ask why the only pictures in the house were of ghosts. Some kinds of pain don't need an introduction. They announce themselves. That first night, the stew she made filled the house with a smell it hadn't known in years. Eli sat at the table whittling a stick with a sharp focus, as if he could carve away his fear. Jonah, after hours of silence, finally fell asleep by the hearth, a small, curled question mark in the firelight. Samuel watched them from the shadows of his chair. He couldn't decide what unsettled him more, the sudden noise of a family in his quiet home, or the terrifying way it felt like it belonged there. "His father died 3 months ago," Cora said suddenly, her voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. "Fever. Took him in under a week." She stared into the flames, her reflection staring back. "We had nothing left. No land, no kin to speak of. Your ad on the mercantile board, it felt like the only road left to take." Samuel didn't offer condolences. Words like sorry were cheap, and they both knew it. She finally looked at him, her eyes dark and steady. "Don't make me regret coming here." Before he could answer, she stood and started clearing the dishes, moving with a purpose that dared the silence to challenge her. Later, long after the house had fallen quiet again, Samuel sat alone at the table. He picked up his coffee cup, drank the cold dregs, and stared at the empty chair across from him. He didn't know what he'd let into his home, a desperate widow or something else entirely. He looked out the window into the oppressive dark. He had a feeling the storm that had pushed her to his door wasn't just behind her. It was coming for them both. The next morning broke cold and gray, the sun a pale smear across the horizon. Samuel was up before it, the thud of his boots on the floorboards a familiar rhythm. But today, the rhythm was broken. A soft clinking came from the kitchen, a whispered hum. He walked in to find Cora already there, sleeves rolled up, a pan of cornbread sizzling on the stove. She moved around his kitchen like she'd been born in it. She didn't look up, just kept stirring. "Hope you don't mind," she said. "Your pantry was looking a little lonely." "Don't mind," he grunted, and it was the truth. Eli was at the table, the whittling knife back in his hand. Jonah was watching him, mesmerized. The house was alive. It was terrifying. Breakfast was a quiet affair, but it wasn't the tense silence of strangers anymore. It was the quiet of people testing the ground, seeing if it would hold their weight. The cornbread was warm and sweet. Samuel hadn't tasted anything like it in 5 years. After the meal, he pushed his chair back. "Fence on the east ridge needs mending." He looked straight at the boy. "Eli, you want to ride out with me?" Surprise flickered across Cora's face. Eli's head snapped up, his eyes wide. He nodded, his expression carefully blank. "I can help." "Can I go too?" Jonah piped up, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "Not today, little bird," Cora said softly. "You and I have work to do here." Samuel didn't wait. He was already headed for the barn. They rode out in the thin morning light, 2 silent figures against a vast, empty landscape. Samuel watched the boy from the corner of his eye. Eli rode stiffly at first, but he learned fast. He had the look of someone who'd never been given a chance, but was determined to take one. "Ever mended a fence before?" Samuel asked. "No, sir, but I learned quick." "You can stop calling me, sir." "All right." The work was hard. The wind was relentless. They didn't talk much, just the grunt of effort and the sharp ring of the hammer against staples. At midday, they stopped at the top of the ridge. The whole valley spread out below them, a patchwork of brown and gray. Eli stared at it, his young face old with worry. "You ever think about leaving all this?" he asked suddenly. Samuel followed his gaze. "I did. Once." "What stopped you?" He thought of a small grave on the other side of the property, a grave no one else knew was there. "Didn't find anywhere else worth going." Eli nodded, as if that was the most sensible thing he'd ever heard. Mama always said every town was just a stop on the way to the next bad thing. He paused, then looked at Samuel. "Maybe this one's different." "That what she thinks?" "I don't know," Eli admitted. "But she doesn't jump at shadows here. Not yet, anyway." The silence on the ride back was different. It wasn't empty. It felt like the beginning of something. Maybe trust. When they got back, Jonah came running out of the house, his face bright. "Mama said you'd come back muddy," he yelled up at Eli. "I'll try harder next time," Eli shot back. And for the first time, a real grin split his face. He looked like a boy. Samuel dismounted, his eyes finding Cora, who was watching from the porch. "He work hard?" she asked, her voice quiet. "He works smart," Samuel replied. A faint smile touched her lips. "He gets that from his father." The words hung in the air between them, a bridge to a past he didn't know and she wouldn't speak of. He didn't push. That night, after the boys were asleep, she brought out a small tin box. She opened it on the table. Inside were a few folded papers, a pair of broken spectacles, and a single creased photograph. A man with a tired smile, his hand on a younger Eli's shoulder. "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was a dreamer, always chasing something just over the horizon, died trying to make something out of nothing. "You're doing just fine," Samuel said, his voice softer than he intended. Her eyes glistened for a second. "Thank you." And that's when the knock came. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a slam of a fist against the door, hard and urgent. Too late for a social call. Far too late. Cora froze, her hand hovering over the tin box. Eli, who hadn't been asleep, sat bolt upright on his pallet. Samuel was already moving, the rifle in his hand before he even reached the door. He yanked it open. A man stood on the porch, draped in a long duster coat, his face grim. He looked like an undertaker. "You Samuel Vance?" he asked, his voice low. "I am." "Name's Carver. I ride dispatch out of Gray Hollow." He nodded back toward the dark road. "Found a man about 6 miles back. Horse shot out from under him. He was dying. Said your name." A cold knot tightened in Samuel's gut. "Who was he?" Carver's eyes were filled with pity. "Didn't give a name. He just said one thing before he passed." Carver leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He said, "Tell Vance, the debt is due. Tell him Mara's coming to collect." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Mara, a ghost from a life he had burned and buried. He stepped back inside, slamming the door shut, the sound echoing the finality of a coffin lid. Cora was standing, her face white as bone, her arms wrapped around herself. "What is it?" she whispered. "What's wrong?" Samuel looked at her, at the 2 boys who were just starting to feel safe, at the fragile peace he hadn't even realized he'd started to build. The debt. Mara. It wasn't just his past riding toward them. It was a reckoning, and it was coming for them all. Sleep was a luxury none of them could afford that night. Cora sat in a chair by the hearth, watching the fire die, her face a mask of stone. Eli lay on his pallet, pretending to be asleep, but Samuel could see the whites of his eyes gleaming in the dark. The boy was holding the whittling knife like a dagger. Samuel didn't even try to rest. He sat at the kitchen table, the rifle across his lap, and let the name echo in his head. Mara. It tasted like rust and gunpowder. He'd known Mara Dinsmore a lifetime ago. They'd ridden together, a whirlwind of chaos and ambition. She wasn't just an outlaw. She was a force of nature, charming one minute and deadly the next. She could talk a man out of his life savings and then shoot him for the dust on his boots. Their partnership had ended in blood and betrayal. He'd taken the blame for a crime they both committed, letting his name be dragged through the mud so he could disappear. He thought he'd buried that life for good. He was wrong. Just before dawn, Cora's voice cut through the silence. "Who is she?" He didn't turn from the window. "Trouble you don't need." "She's coming here," Cora said, her voice flat. "That makes her my trouble, too. Tell me, Samuel." He finally looked at her. The exhaustion on her face was mixed with something else. Not fear, resolve. It was the face of a woman who had run out of room to run. "Mara and we had a business arrangement," he said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "It ended badly. She took something that wasn't hers. A man ended up dead. I took the fall." "What did she take?" Samuel hesitated. "A ledger. It had names, accounts, proof of things that people would kill to keep quiet. I thought she'd just vanished with it." "But the man on the road said she was coming to collect a debt," Cora pressed. "What debt do you owe her?" He looked away. "The kind you can't pay with money." A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. It was Jonah, standing there in his nightshirt, his eyes wide with a fear he didn't understand. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's a lady singing." Cora rushed to him, kneeling down. "What do you mean, sweet boy? There's no one singing." "I hear her," Jonah insisted, pointing a small finger toward the boarded-up window at the end of the hall. "She's singing my name." A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, filled the room. Samuel moved to the window, prying one of the boards loose. He peered out into the pre-dawn gloom. The yard was empty, The world was still. But then he saw it, scratched into the frost on the window pane, so faint it was almost invisible, was a single word: soon. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Mara wasn't just coming. She was already here, playing with them, a cat with a cornered mouse, and she was using a child's mind as her messenger. Samuel slammed the board back in place. He looked at Cora, whose face had gone from pale to translucent. "Get the boys ready," he said, his voice a low growl. "We're not waiting for her to knock again." "Where will we go?" she whispered. "There's no way," he said, grabbing his saddlebags. "When she comes, she'll be looking for me. You take the boys and the mule. Ride east. Don't stop until you hit the territories. Don't look back." Her eyes flashed with a fire he hadn't seen before. "No," she said, her voice ringing with sudden strength. "We have run enough. My sons just learned how to sleep through the night without flinching. I'm not dragging them back into the dark, because a ghost from your past is at the door." She stepped closer, her chin high. "This is our home now, Samuel. If she wants it, she'll have to come through me, too." He stared at her, stunned into silence. He had opened his door to a refugee, a victim, but the woman standing before him now was a warrior. And just as the sun broke over the ridge, a new sound reached them. Not a knock, not a whisper. It was the slow, steady hoofbeats of a single horse, coming up the path to the house. It wasn't an army, it was something worse. It was an invitation. Samuel grabbed his rifle. Cora stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists. Eli appeared in the doorway behind her, a small, grim shadow. The horse stopped just beyond the fence. The rider was a man, slumped in his saddle, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. "Hello, sis," the man said, his voice a ragged whisper. Cora's breath caught in her throat. Her face crumbled. "Daniel?" The man looked up. His face was gaunt, his eyes haunted. It was a face Cora hadn't seen in 5 years. Her brother. The man who had vanished without a trace, leaving her to fend for herself. "I didn't know where else to go," he rasped. He swayed in the saddle, and Samuel saw the dark stain spreading across his side. He was wounded. "She's close, Cora. Mara. She sent me." "Sent you?" Samuel demanded, his rifle still aimed at the man's chest. Daniel's eyes found Samuel's, and a flicker of something, fear or maybe recognition, crossed his face. "She sent me with a message, an offer." He winced, clutching his side. "She doesn't want the ledger anymore, Vance. She doesn't want your life." He paused, his gaze shifting from Samuel to Cora, and then landing with chilling finality on the small boy peeking out from behind his mother's skirts. "She wants the boy," Daniel breathed. "She wants Jonah." The world tilted. The air in the room became thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. Samuel stared at Daniel, then at Cora, whose face was a canvas of disbelief and horror. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her hand instinctively pulling Jonah tighter against her leg. Daniel slid from his horse, stumbling as he hit the ground. Samuel didn't move to help him. "He's lying," Samuel said, his voice flat and cold. "She wants the ledger. She wants me." "No!" Daniel gasped, leaning against the fence post for support. Blood was seeping through his fingers. "The ledger is worthless now. She found what she was looking for, a different kind of treasure." He looked directly at Cora, his eyes pleading. "You have to listen to me. I ran with her crew after I left you. I saw things. I know what she's capable of." "Then why would she want my son?" Cora's voice was shaking, but there was an edge of steel to it. Daniel's gaze dropped. "Because he isn't your son, Cora." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a living thing, suffocating them all. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Get out," Cora said, her voice dangerously low. "It's the truth," Daniel insisted, desperation cracking his voice. "You have to believe me. Mara had a child, a boy, born in secret. She couldn't keep him while she was on the run, so she gave him away, planning to come back for him when it was safe." He pushed himself off the fence, taking a staggering step toward the porch. "She gave him to me, Cora. She trusted me to find a safe place for him. a place no one would ever look. His eyes were wide, frantic. I brought him to you. I told you I found him abandoned. It was a lie. I was trying to protect you both. I thought she'd never find you here. Cora was shaking her head, a violent, jerky motion. No, he's mine. I raised him. His father was a dead outlaw named Briggs, Daniel cut in, his voice raw. But his mother is Mara. Samuel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He looked at Jonah, really looked at him, the boy's dark, intense eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw. It wasn't Cora's face he saw reflected there. It was a ghostly image of the woman who haunted his past. Mara. It was a lie. It had to be. But it was a lie that made a terrible kind of sense. The singing Jonah heard, the way Mara seemed to toy with them, to focus on the house, on the family, not just on him. She knows he's here, Daniel continued, his voice growing weaker. She wants him back. She says blood calls to blood. She'll burn this whole valley to the ground to get to him. Then let her burn it, Cora spat, her face transforming. The fear was gone, replaced by a primal fury. She shoved Jonah behind her, shielding him with her body. He is my son. Blood or no blood, he is mine. Eli, who had been silent this whole time, stepped forward. He put a protective hand on his mother's arm, his young face set in a grim mask of determination. He was no longer a boy. He was a guardian. Samuel's mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of this nightmare. Mara's son. Here, in his house. The ultimate leverage. The perfect weapon to use against him. It wasn't just about a ledger or an old grudge anymore. It was about a child. What's the offer? Samuel demanded, his voice like gravel. Daniel sagged, the last of his strength failing. She'll give you a choice. The boy or the ledger. It was a trick, a cruel, twisted game. She doesn't have the ledger, Samuel said. Daniel gave a weak, grim smile. That's what you think. He reached into his coat, his hand trembling, and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was worn, the corners frayed. Samuel recognized it instantly. It was his, the one he thought was long gone, the one Mara had supposedly stolen. Her husband found it, Daniel whispered, looking at Cora. Your husband. He tried to use it against her. That's why he really died, Cora. It wasn't a fever. Mara paid him a visit. Cora let out a sound, a choked sob of agony and betrayal. The life she had been mourning, the man she had loved, it was all a lie, built on a foundation of secrets and death. Daniel tossed the ledger onto the porch. It landed with a soft thud. She wants you to have it, Vance. A reminder of who you are, who you were. She knows you won't ever let it see the light of day. It implicates you in the murder of that deputy in Willow Creek. The one you took the fall for, but didn't actually commit. He coughed, a spray of blood dotting his lips. She's giving you a choice, your freedom, or the boys. The trap was sprung. It was perfect. If Samuel kept the boy, he was a kidnapper, a man harboring the son of a known killer. If he turned over the ledger to the law to clear his name, he would be exposing Cora and her family, and Mara would get Jonah anyway. If he gave Jonah to Mara, he would be condemning the boy to a life of violence and darkness and betraying the woman he was beginning to realize he couldn't live without. Every path led to ruin. You have until sundown, Daniel gasped, before his eyes rolled back and he collapsed in a heap in the dust. The sun was climbing higher, a merciless eye in a cloudless sky. Samuel looked from the unconscious man on the ground to the terrified woman on his porch, to the small, silent boy who was the epicenter of this storm. Sundown. The clock was ticking. Mara had them checkmated. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed Samuel Vance was still the same man he was 5 years ago. She assumed he was a man who ran. She was about to find out how wrong she was. The hours after Daniel's collapse were a blur of frantic, silent preparation. Cora, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask, dragged her brother into the barn, tending to his wound with a grim efficiency. She didn't speak to him. She didn't speak to anyone. She moved like an automaton, her grief and fury a tightly coiled spring inside her. Samuel didn't touch the ledger. It lay on the porch where Daniel had dropped it, a venomous snake waiting to strike. He knew what was inside, not just the names and numbers of their illicit enterprise, but a final damning entry forged in Mara's hand but mimicking his own, confessing to a murder he had walked away from, a crime Mara herself had committed. It was his ghost, bound in leather. Instead, he gathered weapons: the rifle, the shotgun from the mantel, a pair of old Navy revolvers he hadn't touched in years. He laid them on the kitchen table, the metal gleaming coldly in the afternoon light. Eli watched him, his young face hard. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice steady. "We're not giving him up," Samuel said. It wasn't a plan. It was a declaration. "I know that," Eli said. "I can shoot. Let me help." "Your job," Samuel said, meeting the boy's eyes, "is to keep your mother and brother safe. There's a loose floorboard in their room. Under it is a crawl space that leads out to the old well. If they get in the house, you get them out. You understand?" Eli's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He understood. He was the last line of defense. The afternoon sun beat down on the small ranch, baking the dust and sucking the moisture from the air. The world was quiet, too quiet. It was the silence of an ambush. Inside the barn, Daniel finally stirred. Cora was there, sitting on a hay bale, watching him. "You lied to me," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "For years. You let me believe my husband was a good man. You let me grieve a lie." Daniel winced, trying to sit up. "I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" she scoffed, a bitter, broken sound. "You used me. You used my home to hide her son. You made my life a cage." "I was scared, Cora," he whispered. "She would have killed me. She would have killed you too, if you hadn't taken the boy." "She still might," Cora said, standing up. "But it won't be because we ran. It won't be because we gave in." She walked to the barn door, then paused. "When this is over, Daniel, if we're still standing, you and I are done." She walked back to the house, her back straight, her head held high. She walked into the kitchen and picked up the shotgun. She didn't ask Samuel how to use it. She just watched him load his own weapons, her eyes memorizing every movement. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. The shadows grew long, stretching like grasping fingers across the yard. Jonah, who had been hiding in his room all day, suddenly appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding the small, crudely carved wooden horse Eli had made for him. He walked to Samuel and held it out. "This is for you," he said, his voice small but clear. Samuel looked down at the boy. Jonah's eyes were filled with a terrifying, adult understanding. "He's not my real brother, is he?" Jonah asked, looking over at Eli. "And she's not my real mom." Before anyone could answer, he looked at Cora. "But you are my mother," he said, a statement of unwavering fact. Then he looked at Samuel. "And you're the one who's going to keep the monsters away." He pressed the wooden horse into Samuel's hand. "You'll need this." A lump formed in Samuel's throat, thick and hard. He closed his hand around the small piece of wood. It felt heavier than any rifle. And then, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the ridge, they heard it. The sound of horses. Not one, not two, an army. They were coming from all sides, the rhythmic pounding of hooves, a death drum growing louder and louder. Samuel moved to the front window, Cora to the back. Eli stood in the hallway, his hand on the handle of the cellar door, his eyes locked on Jonah. From the twilight, a voice rang out, clear and musical, a chilling counterpoint to the impending violence. "Samuel! I've come for what's mine!" It was Mara. A figure emerged from the trees to the east, silhouetted against the dying light. Tall and slender, she sat on her horse with an easy confidence, as if she were out for a leisurely evening ride. More figures fanned out behind her, at least a dozen riders, their rifles glinting in the dusk. "You've had your time to think, Samuel," she called out, her voice laced with amusement. "Send out the boy, and I'll let the rest of you live to see the sunrise. A fair trade, wouldn't you say?" Samuel raised his rifle, resting the barrel on the windowsill. His voice, when he answered, was a low growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. "There's no trade, Mara. You're not setting foot on this land, and you are not taking that boy." A ripple of laughter came from the darkness. "Oh, Samuel, always so dramatic. I'm not asking." She raised her hand, and in a single coordinated movement, every rider raised their rifle. But before they could fire, another voice, high and defiant, pierced the air. "Get away from our home." It was Eli. He was standing on the porch, a small, solitary figure of defiance, holding one of the old Navy revolvers with both hands. Mara's laughter stopped. "Well, look at this," she purred. "The whole family has claws." She looked from Eli to the house. A touching display, but pointless. She gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, and all hell broke loose. The first volley of shots was deafening. Wood splintered from the porch, glass shattered, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Samuel returned fire, the kick of the rifle a familiar jolt against his shoulder. He saw one of Mara's men slump in his saddle. Cora was a fury at the back window, firing the shotgun with a precision that stunned him. The weapon's roar was a savage answer to the rifle cracks. She wasn't just defending a house, she was defending a life, a future she had clawed back from the edge of despair. "Eli, get inside!" Samuel roared, but the boy stood his ground, firing the big revolver until it was empty, his small body rocking with each shot. Riders were circling the house now, a whirlwind of death. Torches were lit, arcing through the air like malevolent fireflies, landing on the dry roof of the barn. Flames licked upward, painting the scene in a hellish, flickering light. "The crawl space! Now!" Samuel yelled at Eli. Eli grabbed Jonah's hand, pulling him toward the back room, but it was too late. The back door burst inward, splintered off its hinges, and two of Mara's men stormed in. Samuel spun, firing his revolver, dropping one of them in his tracks. The other lunged for Cora. She swung the empty shotgun like a club, catching him square in the jaw. He staggered back, stunned. But there were more coming. The front door buckled under the force of a heavy boot. Suddenly, a shot rang out from an unexpected direction. The barn. Daniel stood silhouetted in the fiery doorway, a pistol in his hand. He fired again, and one of the men at the front door cried out and fell. He wasn't just Cora's treacherous brother anymore. He was a man making a final, desperate choice. "Get the boys out of here!" Daniel yelled, his voice raw. "I'll hold them off!" He was a dead man. They all knew it, but he was buying them seconds. Samuel grabbed Cora's arm. "The cellar! No! The boys!" she screamed, pulling away from him, trying to get to the back room where Eli and Jonah had been. It was chaos. Smoke filled the house, burning their lungs. The roar of the fire was as loud as the gunshots. In the confusion, a shadowy figure slipped through a broken window. Samuel didn't see him. Cora didn't see him. They just heard the scream. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of pure terror. It was Jonah's voice. Everything stopped. The gunfire, the shouting, the world itself seemed to fall silent. Samuel and Cora turned toward the sound. The back room was empty. A single small boot lay on the floor. Eli was on the ground, a dark bruise swelling on his temple. Dazed, but alive. "He took him," Eli whispered, his voice cracking. "Through the window. He took Jonah." Cora let out a sound of pure anguish, a mother's primal cry of loss. Samuel's blood ran cold. It had all been a distraction. The firefight, the attack on the house, it was all a feint. Mara had never intended to win by force. She just wanted to create enough chaos to snatch her prize. He burst out the back door, his revolver ready. The yard was a battlefield of shadows and fire. He saw Daniel go down, overwhelmed by 3 of Mara's men. He saw the last of the riders melting back into the trees, and he saw her, Mara. She was on her horse at the edge of the woods, and in front of her, held tight, was a small, struggling shape. Jonah. Their eyes met across the flame-lit yard. She gave him a slow, triumphant smile. It was a smile that said, "Checkmate." She turned her horse and vanished into the darkness. A white-hot rage, pure and absolute, surged through Samuel. This wasn't about a ledger anymore. This wasn't about a ghost from his past. This was about a boy who had looked at him and trusted him to keep the monsters away. He had failed. He turned back to the house. Cora was on her knees, holding the single small boot, her body racked with sobs. Eli was trying to help her up, his own face streaked with tears. "Stay here," Samuel said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Put out the fire. Bar the door." "Samuel, no!" Cora cried, looking up at him, her eyes wild with grief. "You can't go after them alone." He looked down at her, at the ruins of their fragile peace, at the ashes of their home. He reached down and gently took the ledger from where it had fallen on the porch. He tucked it into his coat. Then he reached into his own pocket and pulled out the small, carved wooden horse Jonah had given him. He pressed it into her hand. "She thinks she's won," Samuel said, his voice deadly calm. "She thinks this is over." He turned and strode toward the one remaining horse in the corral, a dark shape against the burning barn. "She's about to learn," he said to the night, "that it's just begun." The trail was easy to follow, a single horse carrying double weight, moving fast through the treacherous hill country. Mara wasn't trying to hide. She was arrogant. She believed she had already won. She was leading him, Samuel realized, leading him to a place of her choosing. He didn't care. He rode with a reckless abandon, the bay horse beneath him straining with effort. The rage in his chest had cooled into something harder, sharper, a shard of ice. He wasn't thinking. He was just moving, a predator on the scent of its prey. The moon broke through the clouds, bathing the rocky landscape in a pale, ghostly light. He knew these hills. A lifetime ago, he and Mara had used them as a hideout. He knew the box canyons, the forgotten mining trails, the places a person could disappear. He knew where she was going, an old, abandoned claim shack perched on the edge of a ravine known as Widow's Leap, a place of bad memories and broken promises. He dismounted a half-mile out, tethering the bay in a thicket of pines. The rest of the way he went on foot, moving like a ghost through the shadows. The rifle felt like an extension of his arm. The small wooden horse was a hard lump in his pocket, a constant reminder of his promise. A single lantern glowed in the shack's window, a lonely beacon in the vast darkness. He circled around, using the rocks and twisted junipers for cover. There was one guard, a big man leaning against the shack wall, smoking a cigarette. Samuel didn't have time for subtlety. He moved in a blur. The butt of his rifle came up in a silent, brutal arc, connecting with the man's temple. The guard crumpled without a sound. Samuel flattened himself against the rough wood of the shack, his heart pounding a steady, cold rhythm. He could hear voices inside, Mara's, low and soothing, and Jonah's, small and defiant. "He's not coming for you," Mara was saying. "He's a coward. He chose the ledger. He chose himself, just like he always does." "You're a liar!" Jonah's voice shot back, filled with more courage than any child should have to possess. "He's coming, and he's going to make you go away." A small, sad laugh from Mara. "Oh, you have his fire. I'll give you that. It's a shame you got her weakness, too." Samuel didn't wait to hear more. He kicked the door. It exploded inward, ripped from its rusted hinges. He stormed in, the rifle leveled, his eyes locking on Mara. She was sitting at a crude wooden table, a cup of coffee in her hand. Jonah was tied to a chair in the corner, a gag in his mouth, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. Mara didn't look surprised. She looked pleased. She slowly stood up, a smile playing on her lips. "Samuel, I knew you couldn't resist a grand entrance." "Let the boy go, Mara." "Or what?" she taunted, taking a step toward Jonah, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You'll shoot me? Right here in front of him? What a fine example you'd be setting for my son." "He's not your son," Samuel growled. "You gave up that right when you abandoned him." "I didn't abandon him," she hissed, her smile vanishing, replaced by a flash of raw fury. I saved him! From a life of running, of looking over his shoulder. I gave him a chance at peace. Something you could never give anyone. Peace? Samuel scoffed. You wouldn't know the meaning of the word. You destroy everything you touch. I gave him to a good woman. Mara's voice was rising, cracking with an emotion he'd never heard from her before. A woman with a home, with a kind heart. I watched them, from a distance. I made sure he was safe. I was going to leave him there. I was. Then what changed? Samuel asked, taking a slow step into the room. Her eyes, wild and glittering in the lantern light, met his. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't just greed or vengeance driving her. It was something deeper, something broken. You changed, she whispered. You were happy. I saw it. I saw you with her. With him. You were building the one thing I could never have. A family. You were replacing me. You were replacing her. The name hung in the air between them. Her. His wife. The woman Mara had killed in a jealous rage all those years ago. This was never about the ledger, was it? Samuel said, the final terrible piece of the puzzle clicking into place. It was never even about Jonah. It was always about you, she breathed. About making you feel what I felt that day. The day you chose her over me. I wanted you to lose everything you loved. Again. She was insane. The years of running, of violence, had twisted her mind into a knot of obsession and hate. Suddenly she lunged. Not at Samuel, at Jonah. She drew a knife from her boot, a flash of deadly steel, and held it to the boy's throat. Now, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm, you have a choice, the ledger, or the boy. You can't have both. Samuel froze. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in his hands. The ledger won't save you, Mara, he said, his voice quiet. No, she agreed, but watching you hand it over, watching you choose your own skin over his, that will be better than any freedom. He slowly, deliberately, reached into his coat. He pulled out the leather-bound book. Her eyes gleamed with triumph. Throw it on the table, she commanded. He held it for a moment, his gaze locked with hers. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, he didn't throw it on the table. He threw it into the fireplace. It landed in the glowing embers of a dying fire. The dry leather caught instantly, flames erupting around it. No! Mara screamed, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a split second her attention was diverted, her grip on the knife loosening. It was the only opening Samuel needed. He moved. He wasn't a rancher anymore. He was the man he used to be, a creature of instinct and violence. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his hand shooting out, grabbing her wrist, twisting it with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the floor. She shrieked in pain and rage, lashing out at him with her free hand. He shoved her, hard. She stumbled backward, tripping over a stool, and slammed against the far wall, her head hitting the rough wood with a dull thud. She slid to the floor, stunned. Samuel didn't spare her a second glance. He rushed to Jonah, slicing through the ropes with his own knife. The boy launched himself into his arms, clinging to him with a desperate strength. I knew you'd come, Jonah sobbed into his shoulder. Always, Samuel whispered, holding him tight. The fire in the hearth was spreading, licking up the dry chimney, catching on the tinderbox walls of the old shack. Smoke was beginning to fill the small space. He scooped Jonah into his arms and turned for the door. Behind them, Mara was stirring, pushing herself up, her face a mask of hate. She saw the dropped knife and started crawling toward it. Samuel hesitated for only a heartbeat. He raised his revolver, aimed not at her, but at the lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. He fired. The lantern exploded, showering the room in burning oil. The flames roared to life, engulfing the shack in a hungry inferno. He didn't look back again. He burst out into the cool night air, the boy held tight against his chest, and ran. Behind them, the shack became a funeral pyre, a blazing monument to a past that was finally truly being consumed by the flames. He didn't stop until he saw the faint, welcoming light of his own ranch in the distance. a single lamp burning in the window like a prayer. He had made a promise, and this time he had kept it. The weeks that followed the fire were quiet. It was a fragile, wounded quiet, filled with unspoken things. The barn was a heap of charred timbers. The house bore the scars of the fight, pockmarked with bullet holes and boarded-up windows. But it was standing, and they were all still inside it. Daniel had survived. Cora had patched him up, her movements efficient and cold. When he was strong enough to ride, he left without a word, leaving only a note on the table. "I don't deserve forgiveness. Just tell her I'm sorry." Cora read it once, then crumpled it and threw it into the stove. Eli became his mother's shadow, his youthful face now permanently etched with a grim seriousness. He worked beside Samuel, mending fences, patching the roof, his silence a constant, steady presence. He was no longer a boy playing at being a man. He was a survivor. And Jonah changed. The terror faded from his eyes, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He stayed close to Cora, but his eyes were always on Samuel. He would sit on the porch steps for hours, watching Samuel work, as if to reassure himself that this quiet, steady man was real, that he wasn't going to vanish. One evening, as Samuel was cleaning his rifle on the porch, Jonah came and sat beside him. He didn't speak for a long time. "Is she gone?" he finally asked, his voice small. "Yes," Samuel said. "She's gone." "For good?" Samuel paused, wiping a clean cloth over the steel barrel. "Some ghosts never really leave, son, but they can't hurt you anymore. We won't let them." It was the first time he had called him son. The word felt strange and right in his mouth. Jonah seemed to grow an inch taller. He nodded, a solemn, adult nod, and then went back inside. Cora came out a few minutes later, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Samuel. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. "The ledger," she said finally. "You destroyed it. You could have cleared your name." "My name wasn't worth the paper it was written on," he said, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "And it wasn't my freedom I was choosing." She looked at him, her eyes soft in the twilight. "I know." The silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with everything they had survived, everything they had become. "I used to think family was something you were born into," she said, her voice a near whisper. "A matter of blood. I was wrong." He looked at her, at this woman who had stormed into his life and refused to be broken, who had fought for a child that wasn't hers, who had made a home out of ashes. "Family," Samuel said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name, "is a fortress you build yourself. It's the people who stand with you when the walls are burning." She reached out, her hand covering his on the porch railing. Her touch was warm, steady. It was a promise. They had been brought together by desperation and fear. They had been forged in violence and fire. Samuel Vance had put out an ad for a housekeeper because the silence was too loud. Cora Hale had answered it because she had no other choice. But sitting there on the porch of their scarred but standing home, with 2 boys sleeping safely inside, they both knew the truth. It wasn't about choice anymore, and it wasn't about desperation. It was about coming home. They had a long way to go. The scars on the house and in their hearts would take time to fade. But for the first time in a very long time, as the moon rose over the quiet valley, the silence wasn't a scream. It was peace. And in the end, that was the only thing worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, and you want to hear more tales from the edge of the world, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments what you think defines a true family. Thanks for listening.